It was an early spring morning in the bustling city of Portland, Oregon. The city had just started to thaw from the long winter, and the streets were alive with the rhythm of people hurrying about, each with their own destination. Among them was a young woman named Emily Carter, a bakery owner with a quiet life and a heart full of hidden sorrows. Emily had always been someone who found comfort in routine. Her small bakery, nestled on a cozy street corner, was her haven. The aroma of freshly baked bread and pastries filled the air each morning as the sun began to peek over the horizon. Customers would trickle in for their morning coffee, some stopping to chat, while others simply picked up their orders and left with a warm smile. Despite the comforting scent of baked goods and the steady hum of life around her, Emily's heart had never quite healed. She had always been an animal lover, but her deep attachment to her childhood dog, Max, still lingered in her heart. Max had been her constant companion growing up, a loyal golden retriever who was her source of comfort and joy during her tumultuous childhood. They had grown up together in a small town outside of Portland, and she had cherished every moment with him. But one day, when Emily was just a teenager, Max was taken away. Her father, a man who had struggled with his own demons, had made the decision to give Max up to a shelter after a heated argument. Emily had begged, cried, and pleaded, but her father's decision was final. Max was gone, and Emily was left with a hollow feeling that no amount of time could fill. Years passed, and Emily moved to Portland to start anew. She opened her bakery, found some peace, but the pain of losing Max never truly faded. Sometimes, in quiet moments, she would find herself thinking of him, wondering where he had gone, or if he was still out there somewhere, waiting for her. One rainy afternoon, Emily was preparing for the rush of customers when she saw something that made her pause. Standing outside her bakery was a dog, a golden retriever. His fur was matted, and he looked thin, his body trembling against the cold. His eyes were large and brown, full of a deep, quiet sadness. It was as though he was waiting for something. Waiting for someone. Emily couldn't explain why, but something in his gaze struck a chord deep within her. He didn't bark or beg for food. He just sat there, motionless, with a sense of dignity that seemed out of place for a stray. Emily's heart ached as she watched the dog. She had seen stray dogs before, of course, but there was something different about this one. There was an emptiness in his eyes that reminded her of herself. Of the years she had spent searching for something to fill the void left by Max. And now, here was this dog, seemingly waiting for something she couldn't yet understand. She decided to step outside, her heart beating a little faster than usual. As soon as she opened the door, the dog didn't run away. Instead, he looked up at her, his gaze soft but intense, as if asking for permission. Emily hesitated for a moment, but something told her this was a moment she couldn't ignore. She bent down and softly spoke, "Come inside, boy." The dog didn't move at first. But then, slowly, he stood up and took a few cautious steps toward her, his paws hesitant on the cold pavement. When he crossed the threshold of the bakery, Emily felt a sense of warmth envelop her. The dog didn't rush to grab food or sniff around for scraps. He simply walked over to a corner and lay down, his eyes never leaving her. As Emily busied herself with the morning preparations, she couldn't help but glance over at him now and then. There was something about him, something that tugged at her heart. She couldn't explain it, but it felt as if he was waiting for her to acknowledge him, to make him feel safe again. In his silence, there was a story that only he knew, and Emily was determined to uncover it. When the morning rush finally slowed down, Emily took a few moments to kneel beside the dog, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out to touch his fur. It was matted and dirty, but beneath it, she could feel his bones. He was weak, but there was a strength in him too. A quiet resilience. As she ran her fingers through his fur, she noticed a small scar on his neck, the mark of an old collar that had been too tight for too long. She wondered about his past, what he had been through, and who had abandoned him. "Where did you come from?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. The dog looked at her, his brown eyes full of silent understanding. There was a deep sadness in them, but also something else, something familiar. For a brief moment, Emily felt a connection, a fleeting recognition, as if this dog had known her all along. It was an overwhelming feeling, one that made her stomach churn. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, her voice cracking slightly. She didn't know why, but she felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. She had never expected to meet a dog like this, one who seemed so much like the one she had lost all those years ago. It felt too coincidental, too impossible. As the hours passed and the bakery became quieter, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary was unfolding in front of her. This dog wasn't just a stray, he was something more. He was a reminder of everything she had lost, but also a symbol of hope for everything she could still find. And in that moment, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let him go. Not now. Not after everything he had reminded her of. "Come on, boy," she said softly, her voice full of resolve. "You're staying with me tonight." The dog raised his head at her words, his tail giving a small wag, as if he had been waiting for her to say that all along. He had found his way to her, and she was going to make sure he never had to face the streets again. As they left the bakery together, the rain had stopped, and the world outside seemed a little less harsh. For the first time in years, Emily felt a sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that for now, she had a companion, one who had come back into her life when she least expected it. And for that, she was grateful. The following days were filled with an unexpected sense of calm that Emily hadn't experienced in years. The dog, whom she had started calling Charlie for lack of a better name, had settled into her life more smoothly than she could have imagined. He followed her around the bakery, watching her carefully as she worked, his presence comforting, as if he had always been there. He had his own space now, a small bed in the corner of the bakery where he would lie down, his eyes following her every movement. Despite his past hardships, Charlie had shown no signs of aggression or fear. He simply existed beside her, as if he knew she needed him as much as she needed him. There was a quiet understanding between them, a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. In the evenings, after the bakery closed, Emily would take Charlie for walks around the city. They explored the quiet streets of Portland, sometimes going as far as the nearby park. She would throw a ball, and Charlie, despite his worn appearance, would chase it with energy that made Emily smile. He wasn't just a companion, he was a friend, a loyal one who brought joy back into her life. But one evening, as they walked through the park, something strange happened. As they passed an old tree, Charlie suddenly stopped and stared intently at the ground. His posture shifted, alert and tense. Emily, confused by his reaction, looked around, trying to figure out what had caught his attention. But there was nothing unusual. She tugged gently on his leash to get him moving again, but Charlie refused to budge. "Charlie, what's going on?" Emily whispered, her heart starting to race. Charlie's eyes remained fixed on the ground, his body tense, almost as if he were waiting for something. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she looked at the spot where Charlie was staring. For a moment, she thought she saw something familiar. It was a feeling she couldn't explain. She crouched down next to him, her fingers brushing against the ground. And that's when she noticed it, a small, weathered metal medallion, partially buried beneath the soil. Her fingers shook as she pulled the medallion free from the dirt. It was old, tarnished with age, but unmistakable. It was a collar tag, engraved with the name Max. Emily froze. The world around her seemed to blur as she held the small, worn medallion in her trembling hands. Max. The name she hadn't spoken in years. The name of her childhood dog, the dog her father had given away all those years ago. But this was impossible. Max couldn't be here. He had disappeared, gone without a trace, and Emily had never heard from him again. How could this medallion be here, in this park, with this dog. Her mind raced as she stood there, holding the tag. She looked down at Charlie, who was still sitting calmly, his eyes fixed on her. There was something in those eyes, something deep and knowing, as if he understood the significance of the moment. "Max," she whispered softly, not sure whether she was speaking to the dog or to herself. The possibility seemed absurd. The years, the distance, the circumstances, it all felt impossible. But as she looked into Charlie's eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, this dog had been sent to find her. This was no ordinary stray. He had a story, a history, and it was intertwined with hers in ways she couldn't yet understand. With the medallion still clutched tightly in her hand, Emily stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed answers. She needed to know what had happened to Max all those years ago, and why this dog seemed to have come into her life now. But there was more to the story than just the tag. There were questions, so many questions. Why had Charlie been on the streets? Why had he waited for her? And how had he known where to find her? As the sky grew darker and the city lights began to flicker on, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of connection to the dog beside her. It was as if fate had brought them together, and in that moment, she knew that their journey was far from over. Charlie had come back into her life, not just to be a companion, but to help her face the past, to heal the wounds that had never fully closed. Emily didn't know how this story would unfold, but she knew one thing for sure: Charlie wasn't just a dog. He was something far more important. He was a piece of her past, a link to the memories she had tried to bury. And now, they were both standing at the edge of something new. As they walked back home, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was waiting for her. Somewhere, out there, was a story she had to uncover. And with Charlie by her side, she was ready to find it. The days following the discovery of the medallion were filled with a quiet tension. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the dog, Charlie, had been sent to her for a reason, one she wasn't ready to fully understand yet. But she knew she had to get to the bottom of it. There were too many strange coincidences, too many signs pointing in one direction. The next morning, she couldn't bring herself to open the bakery right away. Charlie lay next to her, his head resting on his paws, watching her with those intense brown eyes. She looked down at the medallion she had placed on the counter the night before, and a deep sense of guilt washed over her. She hadn't thought of Max in years. The memories she had locked away, buried beneath the weight of time, were now resurfacing. The guilt she had felt as a child, the loss, the unanswered questions, everything was coming back. Max had been her best friend, her constant companion when things at home weren't easy. But when her father had given him away, something inside Emily had broken. She had never understood why he did it. Her heart had ached as she saw her childhood dog vanish from her life. And now, this dog, Charlie, was here, carrying the name Max on the medallion. Could it be possible? Could this be the same dog? Emily couldn't keep her thoughts straight. She needed answers, and she needed them now. There was a piece of the puzzle missing, and she felt the weight of it growing heavier with each passing moment. If she could just find out more about Charlie's past, maybe it would all make sense. But how? That afternoon, after the bakery had quieted down, Emily decided to take Charlie with her. They needed to go to the park, the one where she and Max had spent countless hours as children. Maybe there was something there that could shed light on the mystery. As she walked down the streets of Portland with Charlie by her side, Emily couldn't help but notice how much Charlie resembled Max in so many ways. The way he walked beside her without hesitation, his calm demeanor, his eyes filled with an inexplicable wisdom, it was as if he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to notice him. When they arrived at the park, Emily stopped in front of the old bench, the very one where she had played with Max all those years ago. Her heart clenched as she remembered the laughter, the games, the bond they had shared. It felt as if time had never passed. She could almost hear Max's playful bark, see his wagging tail, and feel his warmth beside her. Charlie sat beside her, his body language still and attentive. He was watching the same tree, the same area where she had once run with Max. It felt surreal, almost as if the dog knew the place, as if he had been there before. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as the memories flooded back. Could this really be happening? Could this dog, this golden retriever, be the very same one who had been a part of her childhood? "Charlie," she whispered, her voice trembling. Are you Max?" She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but the dog merely sat there, his head tilted slightly as he gazed at her. It was as if he understood everything, as if he had heard her question and was waiting for her to come to terms with it on her own. The thought was absurd. It couldn't be possible. And yet, the connection was undeniable. This dog, this golden retriever, carried with him the same spirit, the same quiet strength that had always been Max. Emily didn't know how, but she knew deep down that Charlie was somehow the answer to the questions that had haunted her for so long. That evening, Emily couldn't contain the urge to investigate further. She returned home with Charlie and sat down at her laptop, her fingers trembling as she searched for any information about Max, or about a golden retriever named Lucky, as the shelter had referred to him. She scoured the internet for hours, looking for any leads that might bring her closer to the truth. And then, she found something. There, in the old records of a small shelter in Queens, she found the name, Lucky. The dog had come to the shelter years ago, abandoned, with a collar mark on his neck, a collar that had been too tight. The shelter had kept the dog, but he had never really connected with anyone there. He had always been waiting for someone, something. Her heart pounded as she clicked through the pages. It was then that she saw it, the name of the man who had dropped Lucky off at the shelter. It was the same surname as her father's. Tears filled her eyes as she realized the significance of what she had found. Lucky was Max. Max had somehow found his way back to her. The next morning, Emily's mind was swirling with everything she had uncovered. She felt as though she were standing on the precipice of something huge, something that would close a chapter in her life she had never expected to revisit. She had always believed that Max, her childhood dog, had been lost forever, taken away by her father's harsh decision. But now, here he was, found. And somehow, Charlie, the dog she had adopted to fill the void, was Max, or at least a reincarnation of all that Max had been. Her heart was heavy, but there was a strange sense of peace that seemed to settle in her chest. She knew she had to take the next step. She couldn't sit back anymore and wonder what could have been. This was her chance to make things right, not just for herself, but for Max, and for Charlie. With Charlie lying calmly next to her, Emily made up her mind. She would visit the shelter in Queens, the one that had kept Max, Lucky, before he had disappeared. She had to understand the full story, learn everything about how Max had made his way to the shelter, and why he had wandered the streets for so long. The drive to Queens felt longer than it should have, each mile heavy with anticipation and the gnawing sense of unease that something important was about to happen. Charlie lay by her side, as always, with a quiet dignity, his body language reassuring and calm despite the emotional whirlwind Emily was experiencing. When they arrived at the shelter, it was as rundown as she had imagined. The rusted fence, the small, crooked gate, the peeling paint on the building, everything about the place seemed to speak of forgotten stories, lost memories, and abandoned hopes. It looked as though time had passed this shelter by, and yet, it had somehow played a pivotal role in the reunion Emily was now living through. The woman who greeted her at the shelter was kind, her face lined with the years of experience that came with working in a place like this. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes softening as she noticed Charlie's calm demeanor. I'm looking for a dog," Emily said hesitantly, her words catching in her throat. "I found him. Or, I think I did." She paused, not sure how to explain what had happened, what she had learned, what she felt. "I think he used to be here." The woman, whose name was Ellen, listened intently as Emily explained what she had discovered. She nodded slowly as Emily spoke, and then, with a glint of recognition in her eyes, she said, "Yes, I remember him. We called him Lucky. He came to us years ago, but he was different. He wasn't like the other dogs. He didn't want to connect. He always seemed like he was waiting for someone." "Is it possible that he's the same dog?" Emily asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Ellen's eyes softened as she knelt down next to Charlie. "He's always been a special dog," she said. "When he showed up, he was thin, malnourished, with marks around his neck from a collar that was too tight. He didn't stay here long. One day, he just disappeared. We never knew what happened to him." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as Ellen stood up and walked toward the back of the shelter. "I can show you something," she said, her voice quiet but filled with purpose. She returned holding an old envelope, worn with time. Inside it was a small, tarnished medallion. Emily took it from her hands, her fingers trembling as she read the inscription. Her breath caught in her throat. Max. The name was there, etched into the silver, the same name that had been buried deep in her memories. This was the dog. This was Max. "Are you sure?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Ellen nodded. "This was his. We kept it when he came to us. We never found anyone to claim him, but it was clear he was waiting for someone. Maybe it was you." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as the realization washed over her. Max, her Max, had somehow found his way back to her, years after being taken away. It was as if he had never given up on her, despite the years, the distance, and the separation. He had come back, not just to fill a void in her life, but to show her that some bonds, some connections, were stronger than time or circumstance. The journey had been long, but it was finally over. Max, the dog that had been taken from her as a child, had found his way back into her arms, and in doing so, had healed wounds she had never fully acknowledged. Emily sat on the floor, the medallion in her hands, as Max curled up beside her. For the first time in years, she felt complete. At that moment, Emily understood that love, loyalty, and fate had all conspired to bring them back together. Max wasn't just a dog, he was a symbol of resilience, of hope, and of the unconditional bond between a girl and her dog. As she sat there, stroking Max's soft fur, she whispered, "Thank you for coming back, Max. I think we're finally home." And with that, Emily knew that no matter what had happened in the past, they had found each other again. It didn't matter how or why. All that mattered was that they were together, and this time, they wouldn't ever have to be apart again. The bond between humans and animals transcends simple companionship, becoming a profound connection that often reaches the deepest parts of the soul. In real life, animals provide emotional support, loyalty, and healing in ways that go beyond what we can rationalize. Dogs, in particular, are known for their unconditional love and empathy, offering solace during times of hardship or loneliness. The story of Emily and Max illustrates this beautifully, how an abandoned dog, despite years of separation and struggle, finds his way back to the person he had once loved. This connection not only symbolizes emotional healing but also reflects the unspoken understanding that animals have of our needs. Whether it's through a dog's comforting presence or their unique ability to sense our emotions, these animals enrich our lives in profound, often inexplicable ways, reminding us that love, loyalty, and connection are universal, regardless of species.